Hi everybody, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, December 1st, where we are putting some closure onto The Haunting of Hill House and moving forward to The Exorcist, which happens to be our last major text of this semester. So I wanted to talk a little bit about The Haunting. If you'll remember, I gave an extension for that up until today. If you're watching this on the 1st of December at 11:59 p.m., you would send your journal to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu via PDF. And we left off by talking about how Shirley Jackson is this great master of ambiguity, so that we can never know for certain what exactly is causing the events in Hill House. But definitely Shirley Jackson wanted to at least suggest that the events were of supernatural origin. One of the things she does is that she tries to educate us in her text about some of the lore associated with things like haunted houses and supernatural events. And one of those pieces occurs at least in page 70 of the edition that I happen to be using, and it talks a little bit about haunted house lore. And this particular passage, it's in the, I believe, third section, talks a bit about the doctor saying the house is described as leprous or in a house of Hades. I think the concept of certain houses as unclean or forbidden, perhaps sacred, is as old as the mind of man. Certainly there are spots which inevitably attach to themselves an atmosphere of holiness and goodness, so it might not be too fanciful to say that some houses are born bad. Hill House, whatever the cause, has been unfit for human habitation for upwards of 20 years. What it was like before then, whether its personality was molded by the people who lived here, or the things they did, or whether it was evil from its start, are all questions I cannot answer. Naturally, I hope that we will all know a good deal more about Hill House before we leave. No one knows even why some houses are called haunted, or disturbed, leprous, sick, any of the popular euphemisms for insanity, a deranged house. There are popular theories, however, which discount the eerie, the mysterious. There are people who will tell you that the disturbances I am calling psychic are actually the result of subterranean waters, or electric currents, or hallucinations caused by polluted air. Atmospheric pressure, sunspots, earth tremors all have their advocates among the skeptical. People, the doctor said sadly, are always so anxious to get things out into the open, where they can put a name to them, even a meaningless name, so long as it has something of a scientific ring. And then he talks about how he heard about Hill House a year ago from a former tenant. And basically, this tenant left saying that the house ought to be burned down and the ground sowed with salt. Remember, we talked about salt a little bit when we were talking about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and all of the supernatural associations associated with the cleansing powers of salt. So another element that is examined is the Ouija board, which is detailed for me on page 187. And this happens to be towards the ending of the text. And this is in the 7th section. And this is where Mrs. Montague is trying to use the planchette and the Ouija board in order to be able to get information. And what we find out from the doctor is that planchette is a device similar to a Ouija board, or perhaps I might explain better by saying that it is a form of automatic writing, a method of communicating with intangible beings. Although to my way of thinking, the only intangible beings who ever get in touch through one of those things are the imaginations of the people running it. Yes. Well, planchette is a little piece of light wood, usually heart-shaped or triangular. A pencil is set into the narrow end, and at the other end is a pair of wheels, or feet, which will slip easily over the paper. And two people place fingers on it, ask it questions, and the object moves, pushed by what force we will not here discuss, and writes answers. The Ouija board, as I say, is very similar, except that the object moves on a board pointing to separate letters. An ordinary wine glass will do the same thing. And keep this lore about Ouija boards in mind when we get to The Exorcist, because that'll also play a role. It's interesting what the Ouija board actually says, and of course, some of the speculation about the Ouija board is that it's moved subconsciously by the individuals who are basically putting their fingers onto the planchette. But some of the things the Ouija board says is home, waiting, mother, home, lost, child, home. And of course, that would seem to point to Ellie, though one of the explanations could be that Ellie herself is from some sort of a psychokinetic or subconscious level influencing the movements of the planchette. We definitely know that Ellie is very psychologically unstable. We definitely know that Ellie is repressed. We saw at the beginning of the text as she thought it was daring to be bringing slacks to her quote vacation unquote that her mother would never approve, and we definitely see how she's obsessed with her mother, and that statement on the wall, help Eleanor come home, without punctuation, goes to show the many different ways that we can interpret the events at Hill House. But regardless, I think that Hill House is a wonderful example of using atmosphere in order to create those gothic sensations that we've been talking about all semester long. So if we were to move beyond The Haunting of Hill House to The Exorcist, The Exorcist is a very good example of what Stephen King talked about in Danse Macabre as the gross out, about basically being as graphic as possible in order to discuss an audience. And it was a blockbuster film, but of course it started first as a blockbuster, or I should say a New York Times best-selling novel that led to the blockbuster film. And I can't even begin to emphasize to you the kind of mass hysteria that resulted in terms of watching this film, which violated all kinds of cultural taboos. And in part, one of the reasons why is not only because it was so graphic in many respects, but it used all kinds of subliminal techniques in order to disorient the viewers, both visually and also auditory. When you add all of those with the 1970s, and it was very much a drug culture, and people probably would view this movie under the influence, perhaps that could explain some of the extreme reactions. And in fact, what I wanted you to do today was to watch about a 20-minute film or so that talks a little bit about the cultural impact of The Exorcist. You can see that in our notes below along with the link, so that'll give you a sense of how individuals responded. And people needed to be hospitalized after viewings. One individual actually attacked the screen trying to kill the demon. You add all of that plus its iconic musical score, Tubular Bells, and I think you can understand why this film had that kind of cultural impact. An interesting piece of trivia is that it earned an X rating in Boston, again, because of some of the graphic scenes. If you are not familiar with the text is just as graphic. So if you are reading the text, one piece of advice I have for you is that if you find it to be too graphic, you can skip those scenes that are too graphic. And the reality is, I've always said that this text and this film has been misread and misunderstood. The key is in the title, The Exorcist. That basically this story is about The Exorcist. And if you've begun reading The Exorcist, and at this point you should finish The Haunting and you should be on to The Exorcist, and it should be a quick read, what you will see is that basically this is the story of the two exorcists who are haunted by their own personal demons. And that said, one of the things that I think Hollywood has sort of played on the idea of is having the possessed girl be the star. And while certainly the possessed girl is the impetus for the events that occur, there is a very telling passage in the book that wasn't necessarily included in the original film version because of length, where it talks about that the purpose of exorcism is basically to torment the loved ones of and the individuals surrounding surrounding the person who happens to be possessed, and less so the possessed individual. However, when we begin to talk about Regan MacNeil, who is the possessed individual, we will see that there are many probably reasons why she herself was selected that we will talk about when we talk about the text itself. But in terms of today's class, again, I'd like you to watch that video about the cultural impact of The Exorcist. And that's going to be basically what I wanted you to focus on. For our attendance question, I thought I would ask you about paper number 2. And while certainly we don't have we don't have a paper coming up soon, we will eventually have a paper number 2 due, because by mid-December we will be done with our class. So I wanted you to begin thinking about paper number 2, even though you may not necessarily have finished The Exorcist at this point, but my suspicion is that you probably have some familiarity with it. So I wanted you to start thinking about paper number 2 sooner rather than later. And my question is what do you think you will end up writing paper number 2 about? Which text at the very least, and why? And keep in mind that paper number 1 was addressing the earlier texts of the semester, things like Frankenstein and Dracula and also or Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Edgar Allan Poe. And then paper number 2 is probably addressing the later texts in the semester. So that would be things like Dracula and also Lovecraft and The Haunting of Hill House, and of course The Exorcist as a possibility. That said, we will be ending the semester with some Stephen King short stories. You don't have a journal due for those short stories, but I wanted to be able to finish the class in the way that we began it, since we began with Danse Macabre. In fact, if you wanted to earn a little bit of extra credit for the class, one of the things you could do when we get to our very last class reading those Stephen King short stories is write an additional journal about those short stories, and you can earn a little bit of extra credit if you would like. Also, I wanted to draw your attention to the class that I'm going to be teaching in the spring in horror film, in the event that you are an aficionado of the Gothic or horror or both. And that would be on Wednesday evenings from 6 to 8:50. And you can see in the notes below, I've got the flyer for that. If you'll remember, I gave a presentation right before Halloween in the Downtown Lava Center about horror film, and that was recorded and is being edited, so I should be able to make that available to you soon if you are interested in learning more about horror film. And it also gives you a little bit of insight as to what the class about horror film would be like. So basically today is for you to watch a little bit of how culture responded to the film and the text on some levels, The Exorcist, and also to think a little bit about what your second paper will be about. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about The Exorcist. Take care. Bye-bye.